Hi, my name is Steven, and today we're going to talk about sliders, and we're going to learn how to connect a slider to a ROS publisher, as well as how to handle variables within the KV language. So to begin with, I'll show you where I currently am with my code. I'm back to the template, so I've gotten rid of anything that had to do with the button or label we created in the previous videos. That way this video is somewhat standalone. Alright, so I've got my simple GUI.py file, but to begin with, to add my slider, everything's going to be here in my KV language. And this will just create the slider that appears, and then later on we will connect it to our Python. So to figure out how to create a slider, I'm going to go to the KivyMD webpage, go to Components, and find the slider components. Now I see some examples of what the slider is going to look like, and then I can grab some of this example code. I'll copy that and paste it. Now I could paste this right into my KV file, but if it's the only thing I paste in here, I won't be able to add other widgets. So to add more than one widget, I need a layout. I'll begin with a float layout, which is my go-to layout, and then I'll paste my slider. So the float layout is my root widget, and then it has one child called MD slider with these properties. So let's run that. Okay, so here I've got a ROS core running, and I'm just going to run my simple GUI.py file, which is inside tutorial package. I see my slider, I can move it, and it resizes with my window. Alright, so that's all we expected to happen. Before we move on, I'd like to show you this hint. So hint true basically allows my slider to display the current value. So we see at first it's 40, which is because the default here was 40. And then as I move it, it updates that, and when I stop, it'll display the value. So that's really nice. And again, that resizes nicely. Okay, so the next thing we might want to do is connect that current value to a function within our Python code so that we can do something like publish it. So to figure out what additional properties I have, I need to go back to my documentation. I'll scroll down to the bottom, and I'll see the properties such as hint that we just looked at. Keep looking. Down at the bottom, there's two that are called onTouchUp and onTouchDown. So onTouchUp basically will get called whenever the mouse leaves the slider. OnTouchDown gets called whenever you click on the slider initially. So I'd like to access the value when you release the slider. So the onTouchUp property. Okay, so now I need to connect that to a function within my Python. So in Python we have a class, this tutorial app class, which we can access via app, which is just the default way to do that. So app dot, and then whatever function I want to create. So I can create a function called slider function. That could have been any name. And then I need to pass it some values. So I can't just type value, even though value contains the current value of my slider. This is Python syntax. So what I need to do is type self.value. And that will grab the current value, which begins at 40, but then changes as you move the slider, and it'll pass that value into my slider function. Now I need to create the slider function within my Python code. It needs to be within my tutorial app class, since I'm using the app dot to call it. So I'm going to define a new function called slider function. I've got to pass it self, but then I also need to pass it the value. So we can call this whatever we want, but we'll call it slider value. And to begin with, we'll just print this value. So we're going to run this to make sure it works. Alright, so whenever I move my slider, nothing happens until I stop and I release. So move it over here and release, that prints a value. Alright. One thing I notice is it's printing a float value, which is okay, but perhaps I want an int value, so we might want to cast that to an int. So now it should match the value that's shown on the screen. Alright, so let's say we want to publish this value. So I need to create a publisher. We will call it slider pub. It's going to be from ROS GUI, publisher. I need to define a new topic, and we'll just call it slider. It needs a type. It'll be an int 8. And then I need the queue size, which will be 1. So we had a few options here. I chose an int 8 since it's just values between 1 and 100. We could have made this a float so that I could actually publish that float value we were seeing, but at the moment let's just start with an int. Alright, so I've referred to this int 8, but I haven't imported it yet, so let's say from, this is just a standard ROS message. We'll import int 8. So that should allow me access to the slider publisher. Oops. Alright, so now we're ready to publish a value. We just need to come up with a value. So we'll say message equals the slider value. But again, we got to remember that that was an int, or that was a float, but we need it to be an int. So I'm going to cast that again to an int here. And then I will print the message. Alright, so whenever this function gets called, it'll print the value. It'll then send that value as message to a publisher called slider pub. So let's go ahead and run this code. And this time we will look at a topic called ROS, or let's see, ROS topic echo, and a topic called slider. When I move my slider and release, I get the value shown here. Alright, so when I do this, I realize there's some scenarios you might want to basically print that value as you're moving, or you might want to publish that value as you're moving the slider. So let's take a look at that. That's going to be a change here in our KV file, and basically this onTouchUp property isn't doing exactly what we need. So we need a different property. So let's go back to the website. And we see our only two options are onTouchUp and onTouchDown. Neither of those really seem what we need. We need like a onMove. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look up, so that was KivyMD. We're just going to look up Kivy slider, because the KivyMD slider is based off of this original Kivy slider. We're going to look at their documentation. So I should have access to everything this widget has, and then whatever is in this other documentation is in addition to this. So I'm looking down to anything that looks like a function. So I've got onTouchDown, onTouchMove, and onTouchUp. So there we go. OnTouchMove is what we want. So I'm going to copy that. And I can just replace onTouchUp with onTouchMove. Okay, let's run that again. We'll publish our topic called slider. And now as I move my slider, I see I get a continuous stream of data. Alright, so that is all we needed to cover to get this topic published. Now there's one other thing I wanted to talk about, is basically how you handle these variables, such as value, here within the KV language. So let's start with an example. Perhaps you want to create a label that prints the value of slider. So let's go to the KivyMD components, and there should be one called label, and there is. And let's just grab a label. So MD label, is going to be another child of our main root, which is float layer out. So it'll be a child along with the child MD slider. So now that I've done that, let's just run this and see what it looks like. So now I have my label and I have my slider. They're right on top of each other. So first we'll fix that before we move on. And the reason they're right on top of each other is because the label has not been given a size or it has not been given a position. So I'm just going to do some ballpark sizes here, maybe, or let's see, position hint. Okay, so the syntax is a little goofy here. Center X. So 0.5 means it'll be centered in the X direction, and then I would want it to be a little higher in the Y direction. So we'll say 0.7. Alright, that should work. Alright, there's our MD label. So when we move the slider, we would like that MD label to basically show this number. It should say 41. Okay, so in this text, we essentially need some way to print the value self.value. So what I'm going to do is we'll pretend this is a speed. And this is kind of just the syntax you got to use. And then we're going to print the value as an integer. And now you might be tempted to say that value is just self.value, or maybe it's just value, but neither of those would work. Basically, self is only good within your particular widget. So I could use self anywhere within these properties, but it does not span outside of this singular widget. So instead of either of those, what I need is some way to access value globally within my KV file. To do that, I need to use an ID, and I need to give my slider an ID. So I can just call it my slider. And this could be any word at all. So my slider now has access, or now contains all these properties. So I can say my slider.value. And as my text, I will expect speed, colon, and then a space, and then whatever value is contained within value. So let's run this. So I see it says speed is 40, and as I move my slider, it continuously gets updated. So that's exactly what I wanted. I believe that's all we'll cover in this video. Well, actually, there's one other thing I'd like to note, and then we'll wrap this up. Basically, this my slider is probably the preferable way to identify these values. So, for example, self.here, that could have also been my slider. So let's run that one more time. And I should be able to see that my publisher still works. Alright, so I see that the IDs are a nice consistent way to basically refer to properties. Alright guys, well that's it for sliders, and thanks for watching, and please remember to subscribe.